You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. During the Creek War, which spanned from 1813 to 1814, Colonel Andrew Jackson emerged as a national figure after winning the Battle of Horseshoe Bend against the Creek Red Sticks. Following his triumph, Jackson imposed the Treaty of Fort Jackson on the Creek people, leading to their significant loss of land in present-day southern Georgia and much of Alabama. This forced many Creek people to leave these areas and relocate to Spanish West Florida, where they joined forces with the Seminoles. In 1814, while still fighting the War of 1812 against the United States, the British started to support local Native American tribes. A British contingent made its way to the Apalachicola River in May 1814, providing weapons to Seminole and Creek warriors, as well as to escaped slaves. The British then established a fort at Prospect Bluff. Despite being invited to move to Pensacola in late August 1814, a group of Royal Marines, led by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Nichols, initially settled in the area. By this time, Pensacola had become a hub for 1,000 Native Americans, including 700 warriors. After a failed assault on Fort Bowyer near Mobile, General Jackson ousted the British and Spanish forces from Pensacola, pushing them back to the Apalachicola, where construction on the fort continued. Following the end of the War of 1812, all British forces except Lieutenant Colonel Nichols and his men left the Gulf of Mexico. Nichols fortified Prospect Bluff and misled Native Americans by claiming the Treaty of Ghent would return their lost lands. Although the Seminoles showed little interest in maintaining a fort and returned to their villages, Nichols handed control of the strongpoint to the fugitive slaves and Seminoles, before departing in spring 1815. This fort quickly became known among American settlers as the Negro Fort, raising fears that it would encourage slave revolts or escapes to Florida. In April 1816, Colonel Andrew Jackson warned Governor José Massotte of West Florida that the United States would take action if the Spanish did not dismantle the fort. When the governor responded that he lacked the necessary forces, Jackson tasked Brigadier General Edmund Pendleton Gaines with the mission. As part of the plan, Colonel Duncan Lamont Clinch was to build Fort Scott just beyond the Florida border. This execution provided the U.S. with a pretext to monitor and potentially engage the Negro Fort. In July 1816, an American supply expedition en route to Fort Scott encountered the Negro Fort. Protected by a combined force of American soldiers and Creek warriors, the expedition came under cannon fire from the fort's untrained defenders. The Americans retaliated, and a heated cannonball hit the fort's gunpowder storage, causing a catastrophic explosion that was heard as far away as Pensacola, and resulted in the tragic loss of over 250 lives. This devastating event marked the single deadliest cannon shot in American history. After destroying the fort, the U.S. forces withdrew, leaving behind a tense atmosphere. This tension escalated as American settlers began attacking Seminole communities, leading to a cycle of violence. The Seminoles fought back, and in February 1817, a raid in Camden County, Georgia, resulted in the death of Mrs. Garrett and her 2 young children, further intensifying the conflict. Felltown was a village in southwestern Georgia, home to the Miccosukee branch of the Creek Nation, located roughly 15 miles east of Fort Scott. The chief of Felltown, Neamathla, found himself at odds with the command at Fort Scott regarding the rights to land east of the Flint River. Neamathla and his people asserted their independence and sovereignty over this land, rejecting any treaties, notably the Treaty of Fort Jackson, that had ceded southern Georgia lands the Creeks signed. The Miccosukees weren't part of this agreement, didn't recognize it, and didn't agree to any claims by the Creeks to their lands. On November 21, 1817, in an effort to assert control, General Gaines ordered 250 troops to take Felltown. The village successfully repelled the first assault but was ultimately overrun on November 22, making its inhabitants flee. The significance of these clashes isn't lost on historians, some of whom consider these events as sparking the First Seminole War. This perspective was bolstered by a report to Congress from David Bridie Mitchell, ex-governor of Georgia and then Creek Indian agent, labeling the attack on Felltown the beginning of the conflict. Just a week after the Felltown incident, a supply boat for Fort Scott was ambushed on the Apalachicola River. The attackers killed most aboard, including up to 50 people comprised of around 20 ill soldiers, 7 soldiers' wives, and potentially some children, though early accounts and confirmations of their presence vary. Amongst the casualties, one woman was captured, and 6 individuals managed to survive and reach the fort. General Gaines originally had strict instructions not to invade Florida. However, following the boat massacre, which outraged Washington, he was tempted to allow minor incursions into Florida. Upon receiving news of the massacre, Gaines was actually on a mission in East Florida, dealing with pirates in Fernandina. Consequently, Secretary of War John C. Calhoun assigned Andrew Jackson the task of leading an invasion into Florida, specifying that Spanish assets should not be targeted in this pursuit. In March of 1818, Andrew Jackson mustered his forces at Fort Scott, bringing together a diverse group that included 800 U.S. Army regulars, 1,000 Tennessee volunteers, 1,000 members of the Georgia militia, and roughly 1,400 Allied Lower Creek warriors led by Brigadier General William McIntosh, a Creek chief. By March 15, his army was moving into Florida, trekking along the banks of the Apalachicola River. Upon arriving at the site of the so-called Negro Fort, they built a new bastion named Fort Gadsden and proceeded towards the Miccosukee villages near Lake Miccosukee. They burned down Anhaika, present-day Tallahassee, on March 31st, and the next day captured the town of Miccosukee, destroying over 300 Indian dwellings. Jackson then headed south, arriving at Fort St. Marks on April 6th. Once there, Jackson reached out to the Spanish fort commandant, Don Francisco Caso y Luengo, explaining his invasion of Florida was on the president's orders. Jackson accused the Seminoles of getting ammunition from the fort, based on information from Chief Cheneby's wife, stating that the fort must now be occupied by American troops for their own self-defense, and purportedly aiding Spain by keeping it from enemy hands. Though Luengo agreed on allyship, he denied the ammunition allegations and expressed concerns about allowing American occupation without Spain's explicit approval. Yet Jackson took control of St. Mark's on April 7th, capturing a Scottish trader named Alexander George Arbuthnot and 2 Indian leaders, who were immediately executed without trial. Jackson's campaign then pushed further to attack Bolek's Old Town and Maroon settlements along the Suwannee River. On April 12th, on the way to the Suwannee, Jackson's forces attacked a Red Stick village, resulting in close to 40 Red Sticks killed and the capture of about 100 women and children. Elizabeth Stewart, who had been abducted previously in the Scott massacre near Chattahoochee, was found in the village. After destroying major Seminole and Black villages, Jackson declared victory, discharging the Georgia militia and Lower Creeks, and returned to Fort St. Mark's. Around this time, Robert Ambrister, a former officer in the Corps of Colonial Marines, was taken into custody. At St. Mark's, a military court charged Ambrister and Arbuthnot with aiding the Seminoles in Spanish and inciting war against the U.S. Ambrister pleaded for mercy, while Arbuthnot claimed his innocence, insisting on his involvement in legal trade only. Initially, the court sentenced both men to death but altered Ambrister's penalty to 50 lashes and a year of hard labor, only for Jackson to reinstate his death sentence. Ambrister faced execution by firing squad, and Arbuthnot was hanged from his own ship's yardarm on April 29, 1818. Leaving a garrison at Fort St. Mark's, Jackson then returned to Fort Gadsden, later signaling that peace had been restored, and he would return to Nashville, Tennessee. General Jackson shared that Native Americans were regrouping, supported by the Spanish, prompting him to leave Fort Gadsden with a team of 1,000 on May 7th, aiming for Pensacola. The West Florida governor argued that Pensacola was mostly inhabited by women and children, with the men being unarmed, yet Jackson continued his mission. Jackson mentioned in a letter to George W. Campbell that intercepting supplies destined for Fort Crawford further justified his march to Pensacola. Upon arriving in Pensacola on May 23rd, Jackson found that the governor and a 175-person Spanish force had withdrawn to Fort Barrancas, effectively handing Pensacola over to him. After exchanging cannon shots for a few days, the Spanish handed over Fort Barrancas to Jackson on May 28th. Leaving Colonel William King in charge as the military governor of West Florida, Jackson then returned home. Jackson's bold moves caused quite a stir internationally. At the time, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams was in the middle of negotiating with Spain to purchase Florida. However, when Jackson took over parts of West Florida, Spain was not pleased and put the negotiations on hold. Spain was in no position to retake West Florida by force, so they protested. Adams responded by supporting Jackson's actions with a hefty pile of documents, claiming the United States was simply defending itself against the British, Spanish, and Native Americans. While he did apologize for seizing West Florida and even offered to return some territories, excluding Fort Gadsden, he stood firm on the United States stance. The British, on their part, were upset over Jackson's execution of 2 British men who hadn't even set foot in the United States, and there was talk in Britain about asking for reparations or even retaliation. Ultimately, Britain decided not to escalate matters, considering how valuable their trade with the United States was becoming, especially concerning grain and cotton. The British Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, preferred to smooth things over, keeping an eye on the improving relationship between the two nations and moving forward with the Anglo-American Convention of 1818. Seeing Britain's lack of enthusiasm for a strong protest, Spain buckled and reopened negotiations for Florida's sale. Adams, now with an edge, demanded that Spain either get a grip on East Florida or hand it over to the United States. They reached an agreement, and Spain gave up East Florida and dropped any claims to West Florida. Back in the United States, Jackson's actions sparked controversy. There were investigations into the legality of the Ambrister and Arbuthnot trials, and while Jackson had many supporters, there were fears among some that he might use his military success as a stepping stone to turn the country into a military dictatorship similar to Napoleon. Once Congress was back in session, there were attempts to condemn Jackson's actions, but his popularity shielded him. Nevertheless, the executions of Ambrister and Arbuthnot permanently tarnished his reputation, though it wasn't enough to stop him from becoming president later on. In 1819, Spain agreed to hand over Florida to the United States through the Adams-Onis Treaty, with the U.S. officially taking control in 1821. Setting up an effective government in Florida, however, proved to be a slow process. General Andrew Jackson was named military governor in March 1821, but didn't arrive in Pensacola until July. By September, Jackson had resigned and left Florida after just 3 months. His successor, William P. Duval, took over in April 1822 but also left for an extended period before the year's end. This pattern of quick turnover and prolonged absences was common among other officials in the territory as well. The presence of the Seminoles presented ongoing challenges for the new government from the start. In early 1822, Captain John R. Bell, who was serving as both the Provisional Secretary of the Florida Territory and a temporary agent to the Seminoles, attempted to tally the number of Indians in Florida. He reported around 22,000 Indians with an additional 5,000 slaves under their control. He believed that 2/3 of these were refugees from the Creek War, who, in the view of the U.S., had no legitimate claim to land in Florida. The Seminole settlements were mainly around the Apalachicola River, along the Suwannee River extending southeast to the Alachua Prairie, and then southwest just north of Tampa Bay. The situation with the Seminoles was a concern from day one. Officials were worried because without a treaty to establish a reservation, the Seminoles didn't know where they could safely farm without the threat of encroachment, and they were also dealing with white settlers moving into their lands. The lack of a system to license traders resulted in Seminoles getting supplied with liquor by unlicensed traders. The frequent absences and the high turnover rate among territorial officials made it difficult to hold meaningful discussions with the Seminoles, leading to canceled or postponed meetings, or meetings that only aimed to schedule another meeting. Back in 1823, the U.S. government made a plan to have the Seminole people live on a large reservation in the middle of Florida. They held a big meeting at Moultrie Creek, south of St. Augustine, where about 425 Seminole people showed up, and they chose Nehemathla as their leader for the talks. The agreement they reached, known as the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, meant the Seminole had to give up their land in Florida for a reservation of roughly 4 million acres stretching down the center of the state. This plan was designed to keep them away from the coast to avoid trade with people from Cuba and the Bahamas, and it promised them protection, farm tools, animals, compensation for their losses, and help with getting settled, like food supplies for the first year, plus $5,000 a year for 20 years. They also had to let the U.S. build roads across their land and help catch runaway slaves. However, putting this treaty into action didn't go smoothly. The U.S. built Fort Brooke in what's now Tampa to make a point to the Seminole about moving. Still, the Seminole weren't happy and wanted to renegotiate. Worries about another war started to surface. Governor Duval even called up the militia and demanded other Seminole chiefs to get their people to move to the reservation by October 1824. While starting off slow, incentives and the promise of food rations got the movement going, but it was tough. Soon after settling, some Seminole faced drought and starvation, and pleas for aid were tangled in political debates. Despite these rough beginnings and continued tensions, including disagreements over runaway slaves and calls for their removal by settlers, the Seminole tried to adapt to life on the reservation. Fort King was established near their agency to keep peace, which lasted for about 5 years. Yet debates over their rights and land continued, especially as new slave plantations increased the risk of conflicts and runaways seeking shelter with the Seminole. With the election of Andrew Jackson as president, a known opponent of the Seminole, and the passing of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, aimed at relocating tribes including the Seminole to the west of the Mississippi, their challenges were far from over. Back in the spring of 1832, the Seminoles were summoned for a crucial meeting at Payne's Landing along the Ocklawaha River. Here they were presented with a deal necessitating their relocation westward, conditional on the new territory being deemed fit for settlement. They were expected to join the Creek tribe upon moving. However, it wasn't until October of that year that 7 Seminole chiefs set off to evaluate this proposed new land. After spending several months examining the area and discussing with the Creeks already living there, these chiefs signed a document on March 28, 1833, expressing that the land was satisfactory. But, when they returned to Florida, a significant number of them backtracked, denying they ever signed such a document or asserting they were coerced into signing it. Additionally, they claimed they did not possess the authority to make this huge decision for everyone on the reservation. Yet the Seminoles living near the Apalachicola River were more easily convinced to move in 1834. The United States Senate gave its stamp of approval to the Treaty of Payne's Landing in April 1834, setting a 3-year deadline for the Seminole relocation, which was interpreted to start from 1832. With this understanding, the expectation was for the Seminoles to move by 1835. To manage this transition, Fort King was reopened in 1834, with Wiley Thompson appointed as the new Seminole agent. His task was to persuade the Seminoles to agree to the move. Despite his efforts, including a meeting at Fort King in October 1834, the Seminoles stood firm in their decision not to relocate, dismissing the treaty's binding effect on them. Thompson sensed the growing tensions and requested additional military support, while also alerting Washington about the Seminoles' refusal to move. A telling moment came in March 1835 when Thompson shared a letter from Andrew Jackson with the Seminole chiefs, threatening removal by force if they didn't comply with the move. The chiefs requested a 30-day period to deliberate, but eventually they unanimously opposed the relocation. An initial agreement to postpone the move until the year's end was reached with 8 chiefs, yet 5 key leaders, including McCanopy of the Alachua Seminoles, remained opposed. In a show of frustration, Thompson removed these chiefs from their positions and banned the sale of guns and ammunition to the Seminoles, a move that particularly infuriated a young warrior named Osceola, who vehemently protested this treatment. The situation escalated with a series of violent encounters beginning in June 1835, starting with an altercation known as the Skirmish at Hickory Sink. This incident, followed by the unresolved killing of Private Kinsley Dalton by Seminoles in August 1835, further strained relations. Despite these tensions, the Seminoles faced practical difficulties preparing for the move, including getting fair prices for their properties and securing necessary resources, which led many to reconsider their decision to leave Florida. In a tragic turn of events in November 1835, Chief Charlie Emethla, who had opted for peaceful relocation, was murdered by Osceola as a traitor for selling his cattle, an act previously declared punishable by death among the Seminoles. This act of violence underscored the deep divisions and the rising tensions that would foreshadow the conflicts to come. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.